Okay. Welcome everyone to this first session of what promises to be a very exciting and fun and interactive training sequence for advocacy chapters. A couple quick just kind of housekeeping things before we dive into introductions of the presenters and kind of what we're doing here today. This is a standard Zoom meeting type, which means that you all can see each other and also hear each other. So, as we've all learned and mastered over the last year or so, please mute your microphones unless you're speaking. Be courteous to others. This meeting, again, is being recorded and will be made available after the presentation is over to attendees and also folks in the future who might benefit. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin introducing myself, my co-presenter for today, and also this training sequence as a whole, which I need to find it. Okay, can everybody see this all right? Okay. So welcome again to the first session of the Advocacy Chapter Organizing School, as we're calling it. This is the first sequence of its kind, so you all get to be here on the ground floor as we put together a multiple training, a multiple instance training sequence. There we go. That's a weird way of putting it. My name is Mike McGee. I will be the primary host of this session and the ensuing 3 sessions of this sequence that will be happening once per month between now and May, so for the remainder of this semester. And I am joined today by my co-host, Christopher Simeone.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating today. I'm Christopher Simeone. I'm the Director of Organizing and Services. As Mike said, this is the first of a new program and a new approach to this that we're trying here, where we're inviting you to participate in this training and also to commit to attending the next 3 trainings. And as Mike will go through here in a few minutes, there's a full arc of skills that we hope to build with this program over the course of the term. So we're excited that you're here and grateful for your time, and also excited about where we hope that we'll end up at the end of this whole process.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Christopher. So as Christopher mentioned, this is one of multiple sequences of a training. And by the end of this training, we want to set you all up to succeed in organizing and building power at your chapters, right? Everybody here is a member of an advocacy chapter, which, as I'm sure you all know, means that you do not have access to collective bargaining rights, perhaps not yet, perhaps because the legal system in your state is excessively restrictive in that respect. So you all are here representing chapters from across the country, which is really exciting to see you all here in one place. I want to first give an outline of the presentation today, and then we'll be going in a little bit about kind of what the overall mission is and what the outcomes will be for this training sequence over the next 4 months. So we're going to begin today by talking about advocacy chapters and the specific challenges and contexts that we see in advocacy chapters over time and space in the association. Because advocacy chapters occupy a unique position in this kind of work, right? You're not a labor union, you're not just a professional association, right? You're something different, and that comes with its own challenges, but also opportunities. And the primary focus of today is going to be about organizing, right? This is a word that is thrown around all over the place. I'm sure many of you have worked in some kind of organizing capacity in the past, whether maybe you were in a graduate local when you were in graduate school, maybe you've done some political organizing work before, so we all come to this with a variety of experiences, and we're going to present a particular formulation and definition of organizing that we think is best suited to AAUP advocacy chapters. We're then going to talk about collective faculty power, what that means in an advocacy chapter, and how it can actually help you transform in some pretty fundamental ways the status quo on your campus. And the overarching thesis, if one exists, for this first session of the training is that we want to help you move from a particular form of reacting to things that are happening on your campus, to thinking longer term about planning and being strategic about how to build your chapter. We'll go into a lot more detail about that as we proceed. We'll conclude today with some examples of some really successful recent advocacy chapters, or rather recent advocacy chapter successes that will hopefully inspire you and I think have some useful lessons for us as we head into this work. So with that, I'll hand it over to Christopher, who has some initial thoughts.
Forwarded to your Gmail.
Maureen.
Sorry.
Thank you. No worries.
Damien's trying to get in, sorry.
Ah, I see. Okay. All right. So I'll hand it over to Christopher, who's going to talk a bit about the sort of broader conceptual approach here and also what we can expect from each other.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So I mostly just wanted to lay out a few foundational questions as we approach this work over the next few months. And Mike, it's okay if you just want to put all the bullets on the thanks. And the question I think that I first want to start with is, where are we all starting from? And that's a way of us just acknowledging that we are all coming from lots of different campuses with lots of different kinds of experiences and familiarity with this content. So I think part of what we want to call attention to is that there's a variety of experiences out there right now, and to get a sense of everybody is starting from some place here. Maybe you are not familiar with doing one-to-one organizing or thinking about planning and campaigning. Maybe power building is something that is new to you, but you want to do it. That's okay. You're in the right place here. If you've seen presentations like this before, or maybe you've gone to other organizing trainings, you go to all the organizing trainings, you read all the organizing books, that's great too. Okay, you belong here also, and everyone in between. So if you're going through this and you're thinking, well, there's some dots I'm not connecting, or there are some other people who feel like they've done more of this than I have, reach out to Mike, reach out to me. We're here to support you in this process. And ultimately our goal, what we want to do is to give you all the skills that you will need to organize effectively on your campus and to make organizing the #1 program that your chapter is focusing on. And that will all make sense more as we go through the training. So that gets to what will we do? What is Mike going to do, and myself today, and other DOS colleagues who join him throughout this training session. And it is training, right? The goal is to give skills to you so that you can go back to your campus and create a program for organizing and campaigning. Okay. We aren't here with all the answers. We aren't here with all the easy solutions. And we certainly aren't going to be the ones to go to your campus and do this work for you. So our goal is to help you become more comfortable with this content and to be able to bring this back to your own campuses and teach your colleagues and bring them along as well. And then the other question that I have, and we'll return to this, I think, in just a minute, as I ask you to do a little bit of thinking and reflection live and on camera, is what are you bringing to this today? That could be questions, that could be a feeling, that could be a goal. We're going to ask you to think about that in just a second. And last but not least, where are we going to end up? Well, I think Mike alluded to this before, but the hope is at the end of this whole process, you all are going to feel comfortable and ready to go back to your campuses and work with your colleagues to be building a chapter of the AAUP that is focused on organizing as its goal. And as I said, we'll look at different kinds of work that different AAUP chapters do. All that work is valuable, but the work that we're focusing on and what we want to help you build is a chapter whose primary purpose and primary activity is to do organizing. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so lots of us may have different ideas about what organizing is, ideas about what power building looks like. And some of you may know an awful lot about this or have studied quite a bit, some of you not so much. I think the goal here is to have an open mind. Maybe some of this will not be new to you, but maybe upon covering some of this content again, you might have new ideas, you might have a new perspective. Additionally, I would say we're offering our perspective as staff members and organizers, and none of the material that we're going to go through today is meant to make anyone feel bad about what they have done up to this point. And I say this because sometimes, and I've been to organizing trainings, and I feel like the takeaway is, well, gosh, why didn't you know this before? And the cause is so urgent and the answer is so easy. Where have you been? We don't want to create that kind of atmosphere here at all. We're all here to learn, and I think it's a huge step forward for us to be bringing an organizing approach back to campus, and that's what we want to help you do, not make you feel like you should have known something already. And the last thing I want to point out is something to think about and reflect on as we go through this course is your understanding of organizing and your thinking about the chapter and its work is going to change. And it may be subtle, it may be immediate, the scales may fall from your eyes, but your colleagues won't necessarily have had this experience. So think about what it's going to take to bring your colleagues to the same understanding and the same mindset shift that you reached. Okay? It is not something that just happens overnight. People don't like to change, they like their habits. And that's something we're going to talk about today. We have ingrained ways of thinking and doing things that we're all going to have to work on trying to modify and change if we want to focus on organizing. And that's people who have done organizing for a long time, people who have never done organizing. So change takes time, and be patient with others. Sometimes, and I've had this experience, once you see something, you can't unsee it. And sometimes I think some of the work on organizing feels that way. Once you see it, you can't unsee it anymore. And then you work with other people and you say, well, why don't you understand it the way that I do? Okay, keep in mind that other people have to have that same kind of mindset shift, and you as an organizer can help bring them there. Okay, Mike, do I have a second to ask a question, or do we need to move on?
Please feel free.
Okay, so the question that I would like you to just take 1 minute to think about what you want to get. I'll simplify what I was preparing, but I want you to take a minute to think about what do you want to get out of this sequence. That could be a whole range of things. I don't have a particular type of response in mind, but I do ask, and I know this is going to be hard, but I do ask that you try to keep your response to 2 to 3 words. So think about that. I'm going to count. I'm going to give about 30 seconds for that. Okay. So you've had a chance to think. What I want you to do, those of you, I know a lot of us have been using Zoom for a long time, but use the chat feature, which you can identify down there at the bottom control strip. You can click the chat window and that will open up the chat. And I just want you to type in your 2 to 3 words of what you want to get out. Great, you're doing it. Excellent. So I see step-by-step process for forming a union. I see strategies and tactics for building power. That's okay. 4 words is fine. Next steps for what you need to do on your campus, plan of action, technical tools and fixes, making the chapter grow, increase faculty control. Okay, great. So I think a lot of what you all are asking for, what you want to get out of this training are things that are going to be, that we are going to work on. So I think we're in the right place. I will say one of the things that will not happen here is a discussion of the concrete path toward unionization. I did see that as one of the comments. If you do have questions about that, please feel free to follow up with me afterward. I'm happy to talk with you about that and how that applies to your institution. Okay, we're all in the right place. Okay, I think we're ready to go. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Christopher. I really appreciate seeing all these answers because that means that the outline and trainings I've developed are the right ones. So that's reassuring. So I'm going to dive now into some discussion, kind of high-level satellite view about advocacy chapters, right? Some of this might be obvious to everyone. You all are members of advocacy chapters, but I often find it's very useful to take a step back and to gain some perspective, because whether you know it or not, just about every challenge you're facing right now, whether it be because of COVID, reopening, your administration's bringing down some draconian budget cut, you're having a hard time getting some reluctant professor to join, right? All of those things are challenges that everybody faces in advocacy chapters. And there are patterns to what those look like, and there are certain dynamics that emerge over and over and over again. So I want to talk a bit about that, both to reassure you that if you're experiencing any of these challenges, that you're not alone, but also to start thinking about ways like how do we break out of these patterns that are deleterious to our chapter's growth and building power. So I want to begin with what I call the cycle of reaction, okay? And this sounds like a very dramatic kind of like apocalyptic movie. And in some ways, you know, it is a little bit, right? But I don't want to push too hard on that. So for most advocacy chapters, they follow a very similar pattern or cycle, okay? And the cycle begins when your administrations, or you know, maybe your politicians in your state, or some external force that has some kind of power over faculty, does something really bad or heinous or objectionable, right? I'm sure you can imagine, probably you can count at least half a dozen off the top of your head examples of this, maybe many of which are probably very recent. And the chapter, it either comes into being in response to this. We're seeing a lot of that actually in this last year with COVID, or the chapter that had been kind of in abeyance for a while swings into action, right? The faculty say, oh my God, the university, the president is proposing cutting all of the humanities departments. We got to do something about this, right? So then what happens is, you know, a group of really dedicated, heroic, committed faculty either build their chapter from nothing or rebuild their chapter if it was kind of, you know, a bit more passive, and they start to take action, right? They start doing things. They write letters. That's one of the standard AAUP playbook, right? They write a letter. They will go to the Senate. They might do an op-ed here or there, right? They'll start doing things to try to push back against whatever heinous thing is happening. But then there's a problem. When you have a handful of faculty who are swinging into action to do this kind of work, they can do some really awesome, heroic things, and sometimes it succeeds, right? Sometimes it actually gets the administration or the legislature or the governor to back off, okay? But then we're always left with the question of, well, then what, right? Okay, we got together, we wrote the letter, now what happens, okay? And after the crisis subsides, whether the chapter is successful or not, the chapter is then left with the really daunting task of self-perpetuating. Like, what do we do now that this thing we were fighting against is over, right? Kind of like, what do we do when the war is over, right? With all the generals. And this leads to a problem where that original core of faculty who were really mobilized and were getting their colleagues on board, they start to burn out, right? They've really been firing on all cylinders for, you know, semester after semester. They've been holding meetings, they've been writing letters, but inevitably, life gets in the way. Other priorities begin to emerge, whether they're professional or family or academic or otherwise. And then those folks have to step down. And when there's not a pool of other faculty who are prepared to fill that void, the chapter once again falls back into abeyance or back into a kind of passive position, right? Or even worse, as sometimes happens, the chapter dissolves entirely, which is what we see from time to time. So the result of this pattern is that we have advocacy chapters that are either short-lived in the worst case, or more often they're simply unsustainable. They're not able to sustain that level of activity to keep pushing back against the administration or the powers that be to get the kind of things faculty need. Right? You might win one fight, but then what happens when in 3 months the administration pushes something else, right, down the pike? And what happens when those faculty leaders burn out and there's no one to take their place? So ultimately what we see time after time is that chapters who really want to be effective, who want to fight back, find themselves incapable of doing so because of this pattern of burnout and this cycle of reaction. Okay. Now, again, as Christopher said, this is not a judgment, right? We're not saying anyone's doing anything bad. It's just more of a description of a very common pattern. And one of the primary things we're going to do in this training is help you think of ways to move beyond or break out of this pattern. Because, spoiler, the solution is organizing, but we'll get to that. So in addition to this cycle of reaction that we see with advocacy chapters also face a number of really daunting challenges, both external and internal. As we know, advocacy chapters are not unions, which means that you do not have access to lots of the protections that exist under labor law. For what is called in the legal world concerted action, which means collective action, right? People coming together to advocate for themselves. If you're a labor union, that kind of activity is protected and you can't be fired for doing it. You know, technically, of course, administrations and bosses, you know, still try, but you at least have a legal barrier to that. Advocacy chapters don't, and that's a real daunting problem. As is often the case, state laws might prevent full unionization, right? You simply just might not have access to that tool. Even if, you know, 95% of your faculty are willing to form a union, if you live in South Carolina, you cannot form, just as one example, you cannot form legally a union. Okay? Oftentimes, we're in states that have just hostile political climates. There's a lot of states out there that just do not like faculty. At least the people who are in political power are not friends of faculty, right? Of course, the vast majority of the population of the state might believe differently. But you know, you see this even in places that historically have been blue, like Wisconsin or the upper Midwest, right? We're seeing more and more hostile political climates. But the lesson I want to push here, and again, if there's a second thesis I can propose for this training, is that even if you can't be a union, even if you don't have access to that legal protection or that legal process, or maybe you're just not in a position to pursue it if you do have access to it, that doesn't mean you can't act like a union. There's nothing stopping you from acting as a collective group of faculty and advocating for yourselves in ways that a union could. Okay? You have to think about it a little bit differently because you don't have the same kinds of protections or barriers to retaliation. But it's all the same at the end of the day, right? Unions didn't always have labor law protections, right? They began as just workers coming together to fight for themselves. And you can do that too. So when we're looking at the universe of advocacy chapters, especially from the national office's perspective, where we work with lots of chapters in different places and over time, we see not only the cycle of reaction and these kind of these pretty imposing barriers and challenges, we also see that there are three sort of main varieties, flavors, if you will, of advocacy chapter. And I'm going to call these watchdog chapters, faculty voice chapters, and organizing chapters. And I want to emphasize again, none of these is the wrong kind of chapter, right? All of these activities are good and valuable. But as you can see, as you might predict, we're going to be trying to push you towards the organizing chapter model. So let's start with watchdog chapters. Watchdog chapters look like this. There's a small group, generally no more than 10 people, of really engaged faculty, right? These might be the executive board, the officers, plus, you know, a gaggle of former senators or, you know, kind of a faculty who are always, you know, willing to push back against the administration. And these faculty see it as their duty to keep other faculty informed of issues as they emerge, right? The administration wants to propose some kind of heinous program cut. Well, let's swing into action. Let's tell the faculty this has happened. Okay? Watchdog chapters, though, tend to, at least implicitly, rely on an assumption that simply informing faculty of what's going on is enough, right? I think in some ways as academics, we often fall back without even knowing it on this kind of rational enlightenment belief that if everyone had the facts, justice would be served, right? And unfortunately, as we all know, and as we've all seen, especially recently, that is often not true, right? So watchdog chapters often fall back on that. And then they'll ring the alarm bells, they'll send out the messages, they'll go to the Senate meetings, and they'll be like, why are faculty not caring about this issue? Why is nobody fighting with us on this problem? So one step away from watchdog chapters is what I call a faculty voice chapter. And a faculty voice chapter informs faculty, right? They'll send the emails, they'll ring the alarm bells, but they also take it a step further in that they will mobilize and convene faculty to have discussions about what's going on as an independent process, right? So we say, hey, everybody, program cuts coming down the pike. Let's have an AAUP faculty meeting to talk about this. So it creates an independent process for faculty discussions that's outside of any kind of structure that's connected to the administration. Okay? So beyond department meetings and even beyond Senate meetings. So this kind of chapter educates and advises faculty on an issue, right? It lets them know what's happening and kind of what the chapter thinks about it, what the chapter leadership thinks about it. And the idea is that they often develop alternative proposals that they then bring back to the formal channel, like senates or like departments. Just to give one quick example of this, working really well was at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Their advocacy chapter developed an alternative budget proposal in the wake of COVID that they then brought to the Senate and got the president to adopt, right? So that was the way they brought faculty together, leaned on the expertise of the economists and the people who knew budgets, and developed an alternative. Now, there's a third kind of chapter that we call the organizing chapter. And this sort of chapter does the previous two things, which are very good things to do, which is informing and arming faculty with alternatives, but they also organize, right? They also mobilize faculty, bring them together, do collective actions. And these chapters engage in what we call issue campaigns. And as a preview of where we're heading in this training sequence, by the end of this sequence, you will be prepared to mount your own issue campaigns. Okay? And an issue campaign is where you push to fix some problem that exists outside of, or perhaps in addition to, formal structures. Okay? Where you don't just write the letter to the president, and where that doesn't work, you just say, well, I guess we've exhausted all possibilities, right? No, you do something else. And the goal of these kinds of chapters is to build a critical mass of faculty power that the administration has to take seriously and has to deal with, basically, so that you can change the status quo. Okay. So what I want to shift a little, or say a bit more about why we think organizing chapters are the strongest kind of chapters. And again, that's not a normative judgment. It's not saying that if your chapter is in the position where you just have your officers and the only thing you have capacity to do is write letters, that's great. I mean, that watchdogging is a very important function of a chapter. But what we want to help you do is to build your capacity so that you can start doing more. Because organizing chapters still rely on that core set of leaders. But what they do, or something they always have in mind, is how do we expand that core of leaders? Rather than relying on the same three people who've been around for forever, or maybe they're just the most active, how do we get more people involved? That's always the driving question. And as a result, organizing chapters tend to be the ones that can get the most done. They're the ones you hear about, right? I'm sure many of you have probably heard about Rutgers. They're a union chapter, of course, but they're a chapter that really emphasizes member-to-member organizing. And they're always, they're always out fighting the administration about something. And they're able to affect lasting changes to the status quo in a pretty fundamental way. So as has been alluded to already, the goal of this webinar series overall is to help you all move towards that organizing model. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. As Christopher said earlier, this stuff takes time. It takes a pretty fundamental shift in mindset, and it takes a long time to build the skills and to build the capacity necessary to really win a big issue campaign. But it can be done, and That's why it's so exciting to see you all here today, because you're all taking the first step towards really building your chapter into something that can make real change. All right, activity time, everybody, everyone's favorite. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to put you all into breakout rooms momentarily, because I want you all to talk to each other about where you see your chapter currently, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is post a document here, if I can get it to work. Actually, well, why don't we do this? I'm going to break you all into breakout rooms, okay? And I want you all to answer this question. Is your chapter right now primarily a watchdog chapter, a faculty voice chapter, or an organizing chapter? And why do you think that is? Okay, so very simple, very straightforward. Is your chapter primarily a watchdog chapter, a faculty voice chapter, or an organizing chapter? And why do you think that is? It looks like I can't get a file that I wanted to upload into the chat, unfortunately, so we're just going to have to try our best to remember. I'll be floating around to the groups to remind you all. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we have here 34 people, so I'm going to put you all into, let's say, 6 breakout rooms, okay? I'm going to press the button. You're going to get a thing that pops up on your screen. Are you ready? All right, here we go. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Sorry to interrupt what I floated around. It seemed like you all are having some really great discussions, as always the case. There's just never enough time for everything. So welcome back. Good to see you all again. So why doesn't everybody, just like we did at the start, go ahead and think of 3 words, kind of a gut check. How do you feel after that conversation with other folks? Better? Okay. Despondent over state of higher ed. Very nice. Hey, there we go. Solidarity. That's the right answer. No, I'm just kidding. Ready, curious, awesome, validated, shared struggle, angry, energized, not alone, a lot of work ahead. Yeah, that's true. It's a national problem. Less hopeful. Oh no. All right. Well, we'll try to we'll try to correct that as we go forward. Organizing. If it's about nothing else, it's about hope. Ready to fight back. There we go. Okay. So it seems like for most people, the function of that breakout room happened as I intended, which was that it would show you all that you're not alone in the challenges you're facing. And even if you walk away from that conversation feeling like, oh my God, this problem is so daunting, ultimately what it's going to take to fight back and to correct the various evils of that we face in higher ed today is all of us at this grassroots level doing this kind of intense, strategic, but also very, in some ways, difficult organizing work. So you're in the right place to start fighting back. All right, I'm going to go ahead and reshare the presentation and continue forward. All right, so hopefully everybody had a good hiking excursion, good conversations. And as ever, if you have further questions or want to keep talking, feel free to reach out to me. You can also give each other your contact information. I highly encourage you to do that. Part of the goal of this training sequence is to get folks from different chapters together, and you can share ideas and thoughts and work together, perhaps even in coordinate on things. So don't hesitate to do that. Okay, so we've talked a lot already today about advocacy chapters, about various challenges you face, about different typologies of different kind of advocacy chapters. And I've been throwing around this word organizing all day, and we hear it all the time, especially in progressive spaces, especially in political spaces, right? You're always hearing about organize, organize, organize. Well, what does that actually mean? And I want to preface this by saying I'm going to put forward a definition that is, of course, contestable, and in good academic fashion, you are free to contest it if you would like. However, I'm going to put forward a particular definition and version of organizing that I found successful and that I've also observed as being successful with advocacy chapters. So what is it? Well, organizing, when you boil it down, is nothing more or less than building relationships between similarly situated people and converting those relationships into collective power through strategic direct action in order to affect the change that group of people desires. Okay, so I'll break this down each component piece. Building relationships. Okay, organizing is all about building camaraderie and building relationships and solidarity between people, generally people who are similarly situated. Okay, and that could be a whole range of similarities, right? If you want to think back, if you want to be a Marxist about it, you could think about class, right? Working class is united, right, along that dimension. As a faculty chapter, right, we're all united, and because our primary form of employment and vocation is teaching and research, right? We share that. We're similarly situated in that respect. Okay, and you can imagine a whole the universe of axes of what connects people is potentially, infinite. And then you turn those relationships between similarly situated people into power by bringing them together into some kind of organization, in this case, your chapter, that can do things, that can act, right? It becomes an agent, and it can use its power and its agency to change things, to change the state of affairs, okay? This definition is pretty abstract, I recognize. It might not be clear exactly like what this has to do with an advocacy chapter, but I hope it'll be clear as we move forward. And this is the definition of organizing I'm going to be referring back to over the next, over this entire training sequence. So that's a very abstract definition. Let's put a little more, give it a little more teeth, a little more substance. And I want to start, again, in good academic fashion when doing conceptual analysis, by doing a comparison to things that it's not, right? Because in political work or in chapter work or any kind of work, we often confuse things that look organizing-ish, but I'm going to argue aren't actually organizing. Okay, and a lot of this is drawn from the work of a labor organizer named Jane McAlevey, who you may have heard of. She has a lot of great books. I highly recommend her. But this is kind of a pulling it down and then adapting it to AAUP. So I want to start with first is advocacy, which is unfortunate that our chapters are called advocacy chapters. So it's a bit ironic. But I want to start by talking about the advocacy model and why it's not organizing. So in the advocacy model, the agents of change, the people who we look to change things, are professionals, staff, lawyers, or elected leaders, okay? And in an advocacy context, we empower someone else to do things for us, okay? The classic example of this is, say, a lobbying group. Let's say the Sierra Club, right? An environmentalist lobbyist advocacy organization where you as an individual give them money and you empower them to do things on your behalf as a member of the Sierra Club, okay? They advocate for you. The theory of power at work here is that the way we make change is through kind of formal channels, legal strategies, right? Lawsuits, the ACLU is a classic example of an advocacy group, or established channels like Congress or legislators. The problem with the advocacy model is that there is little, if any, role for your average member of an organization, okay? Their role is minimal, if it exists at all. And when it does exist, it's primarily transactional. I give money or time or some kind of resource to an organization that then does something for me, right? It's a very rational choice kind of way of thinking about political change. This is unfortunately often how people view membership in their labor unions or even in their AAUP advocacy chapters. I pay my dues so that if I get screwed by my administration, the AAUP will back me up. Okay, it's viewed as a transaction, which is a problem for building real power. An improvement over advocacy is what I call the mobilizing model. And this is the model we're probably all mostly familiar with, because this is the model that we see all the time, especially in electoral settings. And the agent of change here is often chapter leadership or staff, okay? People who are empowered or entitled to make decisions, okay? The theory of power behind mobilizing is that we do things that have a lot of symbolic value, right? We do things, we bring our members out to do things primarily as props. And that sounds kind of harsh, but that's often when you break it down what it looks like. It's okay, we got to have a rally so that we can get a good photo, so we can put it in the paper, so we can show all the members who turned out to this event. Now that's important and valuable, as I'll describe in a moment, but it's not organizing. Okay? And it's not organizing because you're not expanding your base of support and your members. You're relying on the people who are already on your side. Okay. And another example of this is, pretty common when there is, say, a march through downtown. Marches are powerful. They're very powerful, especially symbolically, right? To show those in power how many people are upset about something. The problem, though, with that approach is that you're not actually getting more people in, or at least if you are, it's marginal, right? It's people who already believe something who are coming out to demonstrate that belief. So members in this context are, again, props, right? They're called upon only when it's deemed necessary by the leadership. We need X number of members to show up to an event. So they better show up so we can get the good photo up, right? Now that can be important, can be valuable, but it's not organizing. Organizing, by contrast, the agent of change is the member, is the faculty member, who then hopefully becomes a chapter member. Because winning the victory, getting the policy change, convincing your congressperson or your president to change course matters, of course. But what's equally important is building up the chapter, building your power, expanding your base of support. And in this model, staff, lawyers, professionals, they're relegated to a supporting role, right? Our job is to help you help yourselves. Our job is not to run the campaign for you. Because the theory of power at work here is not based on access or expertise. It's based on collective majority actions. Our greatest power comes from our numbers, ultimately. Because your administration is always going to have more money than you. They're always going to have more, maybe not better, but more lawyers than you, okay? They're always going to be able to play that inside game better than you can. So the way that we fight back is with numbers and by building power that way. And you have to be confrontational, right? It doesn't mean you have to be nasty. It doesn't mean you have to go up to the president's house and leave a bag of some childhood prank, right? You don't have to do that. But you got to be direct. You have to say, we are opposed to this thing you're trying to do, and here's why, and we're willing to fight you for it. Okay? Now, as I mentioned about mobilizing can be valuable, but it is one tactic among others. It's not the whole program. Having a photo op can be very important. It can be very, very important to get the word out in newspapers and to have a great photo of how many members are out showing support. But that's not organizing. That's one tactic. Because the ultimate goal is to expand your base of support, to not just rely on the true believers, right? To not just rely on those 5 or 6 faculty who are the watchdogs in your chapter, but to get more faculty involved, to get more people who are active and who are doing work. Because again, our power comes from our numbers and not only on expertise or access to decision makers. Okay? Now, I realize this might chafe against a lot of assumptions about how faculty operate or should operate, whoever says should, right? And I think a lot of that comes from the norms of the academy, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So it does require a bit of a mindset shift, thinking about, okay, how do we build power so we can confront decision makers rather than only relying on our expertise? Because, we're all here in the academy because ultimately we're nerds, right? We found some subject that we loved with such a passion that we were willing to commit decades of our life studying it, right? And so we are trained that the best argument wins. Who can muster the best evidence and who can be the most persuasive wins. And unfortunately, that's not the case oftentimes in politics. And by politics, I mean that term broadly, contesting with your administration. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Christopher, who's going to talk a bit about what this looks like in a faculty-specific context. And I see there's lots of questions in the chat. I'll do my best to kind of work through them as Christopher is talking. So Christopher, take it away.
Sure. And so what I'm going to talk about a little bit is, a little bit about what organizing in higher ed context looks like and some of the considerations there. A couple of things that I just wanted to say at the outset. First, there's a question about what is meant by direct action. And we're going to get to that when we talk about issue campaigns. But a direct action is a kind of tactic. It is a kind of tactic that is used to publicly confront, we'll use that word again, and that doesn't mean physically confront, but publicly confront or challenge a decision maker or someone who has control over a decision maker as a means of getting what you want. So an example of a direct action could be a petition, I think. Also, another example of a direct action could be sitting in on a board of trustees meeting. It could be printing out the pages of your petition and wrapping them around a building. It could be all different kinds of things. And, I think we'll talk a lot more about direct actions and issue campaigns later on down the line. And so we're not going to get too deep into that. The other thing that I wanted to clarify just at the outset in terms of your issue campaigns, and we'll talk more about this too when we talk about issue campaigns, is we don't want to send you out with the idea, and this has come up in a couple of groups, that you just need to go run as many issue campaigns as possible. Or if you've already got an issue that you're working on, you need to go do another one. I had a couple of people in my group raise, we're doing a collective bargaining campaign. Do we also need to do an issue campaign? Okay. No, if you're already in part of a union certification drive, that is your issue campaign, okay? And you'll see a lot of similarities between what we're talking about in terms of building leadership and building capacity and the work of building your support and your base in a union campaign. So we'll all come back to that another time. So Mike, it's okay if you just go through just to see the whole slide. So, I just want to talk a little bit about Senates and how we work with them. And I don't know how many of you might have heard this from your administration, but we don't need an AAUP chapter on this campus. We have a Senate. Has anyone heard that before? Yeah, this is a favorite response. And I think the key thing is to differentiate what a Senate is and what a chapter is. As we've said before, a chapter is an independent faculty voice, and is an independent faculty voice that's focused on building power, on representing members' interests, and on making changes. A Senate is not that thing, okay? A Senate is something that is established through institutional policy. It does have an important role on campus, of course. It's part of the reason that, a lot of AAUP policy, I think, works on talking about shared governance and its role. So Senates and faculty can work, or Senates and AAUP chapters can work together, but a Senate is not a chapter. And a Senate is not always the best mechanism or tool to make change on a campus. So I think as Mike had said, there are times when a Senate might be a decision-making body or an advisory body that a chapter could pressure or work with, but they have a different set of priorities and a different set of incentives than a chapter does. So it's important, I think, to separate those things out. A chapter is an independent faculty organization. A Senate is a body that is charged with carrying out faculty governance responsibilities. Those are two very different end goals. Okay. So we can go to the next slide. Another potential challenge with Senates, as you all have probably noticed, is that sometimes they are politically a friend of the chapter or are open to challenging existing authority, and sometimes they are not. And that means that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to how to work with a Senate. But I would say the bottom line, like on the one hand, you don't want to be pigeonholed or said that you are the Senate and you are the Senate are redundant, but also we don't want to go too far to the other end where we say, well, we have no use for the Senate. We're just going to dismiss them as a permanent enemy. So I think there's a balance that we want to strike there. They do operate differently. It's one mechanism for change, but the chapter and the Senate can often find ways to work together on shared priorities. If your Senate does not have, it is staffed by folks who don't want to make change, who don't want to challenge the status quo, or won't carry out faculty governance responsibilities, the way that would serve the interest of the faculty, there are always more elections. And that is another way that we have seen chapters help change the direction on Senates, is to recruit and field candidates for Senate elections, or to help make sure that people end up on Senate who are going to work with the chapter's interests. Okay, I think we can go on. So returning to the definition of organizing that Mike shared earlier, we want to think about change as something that happens because we have built enough power to change a decision maker's mind. Not because we have the right facts, not because we've made the right arguments, not because we got the right policy passed, not because we took a vote, okay? So that means the key focus of organizing is building structures. That's something that we're going to talk about over and over again, is what is a structure, and how is that part of building power within a campus. We'll talk about that more. But okay, moving on. I want to talk just a little bit about organizing with faculty, some common challenges, and then what are some solutions. So just reflecting on what we're bringing to this whole approach and to this exercise to begin with. If you've been trained as an academic, you likely enjoyed college, and then at some point you decided you liked college so much that it appealed to you to pursue a higher degree, or you had some kind of academic interest. And I just want to, now without going into a whole deep dive, just understand that academia and the training that academia makes you go through conditions you in a certain way and encourages you to think in a certain way about power and authority, about what you need to do to advance your own interests, and what to do about conflict, hierarchies, change, and incentives. So normally, civility norms and collegiality frown upon open and forceful dissent unless it's in the context of disagreeing with people's ideas. It's perfectly acceptable to forcefully disagree with someone's arguments or theories. Forcefully disagreeing with the administration about something is less comfortable. So in terms of power hierarchies, there are obviously administrative hierarchies above faculty. I think there's a deeper reflection we could have about how our academic training makes us think about our relationship to authorities. A lot of the process of being trained as an academic involves deference to those who are training you and to those who are mentoring you. So that might not have been exactly your experience, but overall in the academy, it's worth thinking about how we are conditioned to think about institutional power that operates over us, as opposed to power that's out there that we're thinking about or theorizing. And then change, political change could be something that we talk about in the abstract, but there's not often, at least baked into the cake for academic training, a whole lot of making political change that has practical application. That might be different from your experience, but overall, in terms of the kinds of training and reinforcement that folks receive, a lot of it has to do with not necessarily changing what's going on in the workplace and thinking more about changes that are outside the workplace. And then last but not least, I know this is different across disciplines, but many disciplines and many folks who are trained in higher education or trained in the academy, the incentive structure is very individual based. So it's your research that you individually work on. You're responsible for a work product individually. And again, I know that different disciplines have different norms for collaboration, but you yourself are responsible for all of the meeting all of the different professional milestones, all the different advancement opportunities that there are or that there aren't. So organizing asks us to think and behave and work in a very different way. The idea that progress isn't something that is a result of truth seeking or fact finding, it's actually something that emerges because we have built people power. The fact that we are trying to create a different kind of relationship to power. We have shared power and democracy within the chapter, but then we're also challenging hierarchies in the workplace. And that change is something that isn't just going to happen unless we apply collective power to the institution. And then last but not least, we're working collectively on something and we're working together on teams and sharing that risk. right? So the idea is that we're no longer individually responsible for solving problems. And that's one of the central pieces of a one-on-one conversation, is to help people understand that the problems that they might be facing, and the issues that they'd like to change, these are things that they may experience individually, but they are problems that are best addressed through collective action. So trying to make that mindset shift, that it is no longer the bottom line responsibility of a single person to change his or her workplace conditions, but that it is something that we are all sharing. So I'll just go through this quickly. If you are busy, broke, scared, and independent, there are different challenges that are that you face, that faculty face, workers in higher education face, in terms of how you're positioned on the job and how you have been trained. Here's a list of them. The next slide, we talk about how organizing is the solution to those things. So once we have a core of leaders that is diverse, then and across departments and in terms of representation, then we can delegate and share work. So if we have problems with challenges with compensation for faculty, then this is an effective way to advocate for more resources for faculty. Collective action is something that breeds courage and also makes retaliation against any single party more difficult. And faculty are independent, but the process of organizing helps us understand how we can work together on a shared project, right? That collective action and collective activity is something that advances our interest, not just a focus on our individual work.
Okay, I think this next piece is mine, I believe. Yes. Okay. So thank you for that, Christopher. And these slides will be made available. So if you didn't write down every word of all those different 2x2 tables, don't worry about it. You'll get to see them later. I want to now shift gears to thinking about. So we've been talking a lot about fighting for change, right? What does that mean? Right? I've been saying change the status quo, right? Direct action, collective action, right? Well, what does that actually mean in concrete terms? Well, I want to start with thinking about kind of the three pillars that make up an effective advocacy chapter, the three areas of focus that the best advocacy chapters focus on. And the first is institutional policy, the second is shared governance, and the third is member engagement. Institutional policy, hopefully, is very familiar to you all. This is what a lot of AAUP focuses on, of course, which is about pushing to include as many AAUP policies and practices into the institution's policies and practices as possible, right? We all have, at least if you don't have your copy already, you should get one, which because I have a fake background, it's disappearing. The famous AAUP Red Book, of course, and a part of our mission is to make the Red Book the policy of the institution. So this often looks like Senate work, committee representation, handbook revisions, right? The kind of nuts and bolts of institutional policy we've all come to know and love and or hate in our role as faculty. And in addition to that, and very closely connected to it, is the importance of shared governance, where, because of course, AAUP emphasizes and holds that faculty have primary decision-making authority, which means they get to make the decision. They don't just get to be consulted. They don't just, get to sort of like have a position. No, they get to make the decisions about educational issues. And so the chapter works primarily to defend this prerogative from encroachments by the administration, and also to expand faculty decision-making authority into other areas, or to at least make sure faculty have some say in things like budgeting priorities, for example. And then finally, member engagement. So this is where chapters make space for faculty to deliberate on policy questions. It's where they develop toward representational authority, which is where the chapter can say, and they mean it quite literally, we are the faculty. We represent at least a majority of faculty on this campus. So when our chapter speaks, it's the faculty speaking. And primarily to do this, you got to engage in member-to-member outreach, mobilizing faculty to take specific actions, and of course, building your membership numbers, which is something we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about over the course of these trainings. In the interest of time, I want to keep clipping along here and move to issue organizing. Okay, so if those are the three main pillars of an advocacy chapter, and you could ask yourself, what does my chapter focus on? Institutional policy, shared governance, or member outreach and engagement. We're going to, again, push you more and more towards member engagement as the primary function of your chapter, because the more members you have engaged, the more effective you're going to be at implementing institutional policy, protecting shared governance, and also fighting for real changes. Because the best way to recruit more people to your chapter and to build it is to take on things your faculty members care about. That might sound obvious and trite, but you would be amazed at how, or maybe not, at just how rarely this really happens, where a chapter says, we're going to take on this specific problem that is affecting a lot of faculty, and we're going to try and fix it. And it turns out when you do that, people join your chapter, because people generally aren't motivated to change the status quo if they're not themselves invested in the change, or if they don't believe the chapter is invested in making that change. So issue organizing, and again, I know this might sound like a broken record. We're going to talk a lot more about this later. Part of this presentation is to kind of give you a satellite overview of these things, is that issue organizing is all about organizing around problems that are deeply felt and also widely felt, okay? So we find something that faculty really care about, and then we try to fix it. And we fix it by pressuring decision makers, again, being confrontational, not, again, not violent, we're not here to sack Rome, but we are here to put pressure on decision makers to give us the things we want. Because I can guarantee you there is some decision maker on your campus or set of decision makers who could make faculty's lives better and isn't doing it. And so we have to ask ourselves, why aren't they doing it? So this gets me back to my initial thesis for this presentation, which was to try and help you get out of this cycle of reaction, where what an advocacy chapter does is keep defending, keep reacting to things as they happen until you're just battered down and feel like you can't do anything. So we're going to help you stop reacting and start planning. Because to change the status quo, to get those things we want, we got to start thinking long-term. We have to develop long-term organizing plans that are strategic, that are careful, that are intentional, that are proactive, rather than reactive. Because this is the way that we break out of this unsustainable reaction to crisis. Because if all we're doing is defending, you're ultimately that means you're giving up ground over time. Now, this isn't to say that you should stop defending, right? That you should stop reacting to things as they happen, because as we've seen over this last year, you have to do that day-to-day work of responding to the administration because they're going to keep pushing. But we have to start thinking about, how do we push back? So we identify shared problems. We're going to talk about how to do that over the course of these trainings. We develop a plan to progressively apply pressure to compel decision makers, whomever they are, to change their minds. And that looks like, in practice, making their lives difficult for a while, right? Giving them headaches. As a president hates, the only thing a university president hates more than faculty giving them headaches is maybe, like, I don't know, if the board of trustees is giving them a hard time, or maybe like their big mega donor decides to stop cutting checks for a while, right? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to help each other identify shared problems and then think about how we can apply pressure to fix them. And in so doing, we will not only hopefully fix a problem, right? Improve the handbook, change a policy, increase salaries, but perhaps more importantly, your chapter will grow. It will become stronger. It'll become more effective. It'll become more sustainable, and you'll be able to continue